Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the show. My name is Merlin Fulcher. It's Wednesday, the 17th of June. So, obviously, when I started doing this, I really wanted to discuss the big visuals, the big images that were in the media every week. And obviously, it's been another week of lots of that. And really, the most important thing has been this story of Marcus Rashford. And so he is a 22-year-old footballer, and he is possibly the most influential person in British politics right now. So what it is, about a week ago, their campaign got going on a demand that the school vouchers for free school meals would be extended over the summer holidays so that no children who are currently entitled to free school meals during school time would be hungry during the summer holidays. And actually, we've known for years that there are many families that struggle to make sure there's 3 meals a day during holiday times when the schools are closed, and the free school meals are unavailable for these low income families. So Marcus Rashford became the main voice behind this campaign. Purely of his own will, of the strength of his own conviction. He was tweeting, he was appearing on media. This image is an interview he did with the BBC. I think possibly in his garden. This is a 22-year-old man, but he is immensely famous. He's played for England football team in the World Cup. He's very well known, influential person, and he's used that influence to good effect here. And so effectively, he took up this cause. The government really stood its ground, and then had to capitulate and effectively admit that this was an obviously very good policy. And there's no doubt that the millions or hundreds of millions it costs to do this are nothing compared to the amount of money that's been spent bailing out various industries. Not all of them essential industries, and also not all of them companies which couldn't necessarily afford to pay the staff out of their own reserves and other income. So there's a lot of money splashing around to kind of maintain the status quo. And I think what Marcus Rashford's achievement makes very clear is that the coronavirus crisis and the experience and the impact it's had on our economy through the lockdown and through what's going to happen next, possibly with one of the greatest recessions in history, lets us know that compassion is the single most important thing. And this is a man who understands compassion. He says in his interviews that he grew up in a household where getting enough food was a struggle, where it had to be limited, how many yogurts he'd have each day. He's obviously a growing lad and he's an athlete, and he wants to eat lots of food, and so he knew this. He had this experience. It, like so many of us, knew what it's like to there not be enough food in the fridge and to have to really carefully plan everything around to make sure there's enough of it. And so he spoke out. He spoke out for all those youngsters right now in that situation, all those youngsters who want to make a great future for themselves, become athletes and high achievers and whatever, just do all the things they want to do. So he did that, and it was compassion. That was the driving force. And clearly the government, maybe in the early days of the crisis, there was a lot of really compassionate or apparently compassionate moves, but I think a lot of that slipped. And I think really in the last week, it really revealed its kind of lack of compassion, lack of understanding, and lack of really awareness of how things have changed. And so inevitably, there's been a fair amount of kind of distraction announcements from the government. And again, like looking at the kind of images of the week. So we've had some pretty extraordinary things. Actually, two of them related to aeroplanes. So there was an aeroplane crash, a training pilot off the coast. Very sad story. This one particularly actually relates to this. This was today. This is effectively the jet. It's an RAF Voyager. It's a bit like Air Force One. So this is used to transport Boris Johnson around the world and other ministers, so that they can attend various summits and meetings and whatever. Do that kind of diplomacy that in America we traditionally associate having this Air Force One jet that takes them around the place. Now, this was a relatively new development. They dubbed it Cam Force One because it was David Cameron who brought it in. It's just a normal aeroplane that was converted for some military use and then eventually also converted for this government use. And effectively what happened is that today the government announced that they're spending close to £1 million to repaint this aeroplane, and basically to make it jazzy, to make it a kind of symbol for what they're describing as global Britain, this kind of idea of Britain being a trading nation but also having some kind of some kind of visual appeal globally, which you think if we're like one of the countries that's had one of the worst managed coronavirus outbreaks on the planet, you think actually maybe we just want to be a bit quiet for a while and kind of recoup some of our reputation by possibly following through on some of that compassion that Marcus Rashford has demonstrated. But no, the idea is just to paint the plane. So £900,000 is being spent to repaint this plane. Apparently it's going to be red, white and blue. Obviously those are the colours of the Union flag, and that's what people associate with Britain apparently. What I would say is, it's pretty tone deaf to what's going on in the bigger picture. It's clearly a kind of distraction story. Also, aeroplanes, they're not exactly the most eco way to travel right now, not least the fact that nobody is really travelling right now. I'm doing meetings with people via Zoom all over London, all over the UK, and could quite easily do discussions and other things around the world through this medium, and of course we're pretty certain that's happening now. So the idea that it's even necessary to sort of jump in this plane and zoom around the world, does that really set the right example to everybody else? Is it good for the environment? Is it actually right that, say, Boris Johnson and other ministers can travel around the world by this plane when other people are pretty much being encouraged not to travel around the world by plane, not least by any other means of transport? So it currently. So it seems to be a pretty mixed message, really, and it sort of says like one rule for one person, another rule for everyone else, which really, again, the idea of compassion really doesn't exist in this at all. It's basically it's all about prestige. It's all about this idea that you can enhance your own individual standing through being part of a collective nation of a kind of grand national achievement. But also, frankly, I have no faith that it's even going to be a nice design, right? So if we knew that a really cool artist or designer had been commissioned to make a really stunning thing, I mean, I think also, we have a great tradition of this. I mean, look at the Olympic opening ceremony. Look how like the kind of artistic talent that went into that really captured the world's imagination. So we had no real details or even a picture of what this design is. So I'm holding my breath and I'm not really expecting it's going to be that great. But if they take this opportunity to really get a great designer on, we'll see what happens with that. Okay, so the next big thing, and this is such a confusing and weird and sad image, and this comes from some protests on the weekend, and it makes me sad to actually have to share this, but it really was a big image, and this really was a kind of defining moment in these protests, these very uncompassionate, very intolerant protests, which have been described as counter protests, which effectively were held in the centre of London, and it was effectively, these people were describing it as being a protest to defend statues which were under threat because there had been, as previously discussed in this show, a move to dismount, to dunk, and to reinterpret and to rethink some of these imperial statues, some of these other statues which kind of expose the bigger institutional and structural imbalances, the ongoing racism in the wider society, certainly things which have become much more into sharp relief following the death of George Floyd in the United States. So this was a counter-protest, and it, to a large extent, this was very representing people with very intolerant views. I would say opinions which were ill-founded, a lot of factual inaccuracies in some of the things that were being claimed. But really, this was effectively actually a very violent protest, and there were a lot of drunk people. And so during this protest, this fellow, who I would argue was not really demonstrating the most compassionate behaviour, obviously was drunk, and he went for a pee against a column, but obviously that column also just so happens to be where there's a monument to Keith Palmer. Keith Palmer was the police officer who was killed during a terrorist attack on Westminster Bridge and the Palace of Westminster in 2017. So Keith Palmer is obviously a very important person, and somebody who had a tragic death, and when he was doing his service the best he possibly could, and putting himself at risk already by doing a job like that, but obviously he died trying to save other people's lives. So he really is a very important person, and arguably somebody who really gave everything he had to help Britain and to help his fellow people. And I would argue possibly he deserves a bigger and better memorial than the one he has there, which is possibly not in the best position. None of this excuses what happened. So this fellow needed to go for a pee, and he went for a pee right there and then. And it is disgraceful what he did. It's bad enough peeing in public in such a prominent place, but obviously to do it next to a memorial is extremely insulting to the memory of this person, obviously to his family and other people so closely touched by his life and his sacrifice. So this is all wrong, and this fellow was found guilty of doing this. He turned himself into the police, and he was sentenced to 14 days in prison. And I think really what this does is it kind of shows the lack of compassion again, in that this person had gone to take part in quite a kind of aggressive and intolerant protest. They kind of, it's clearly taken way too much alcohol, which is not really compassionate to him or really setting a good example in the wider society. And then he did this thing which clearly is being so disruptive. And really what we need to do is, look at this and say, look, there was a lot of anger clearly, but the solution to problems is not by being angry, it's by being compassionate, right? And so when these people got together to do this intolerant protest in London, really what they needed to instead is to think compassionately about why a bigger debate was beginning to be had on statues, on the imperial legacy of Britain, and actually and embrace compassion. I think the thing is what we also need is our government to embrace compassion. So we need it to be clear. We need our leadership to make it clear that compassion is the way forward, not this kind of intolerant view. Now, I would say not in any way to excuse this fellow for what he did, but I'd say in the bigger picture, though, there is a problem in that public toilets are generally unavailable because of the lockdown. And the government has set down some guidance to local authorities and told them to reopen public toilets, but they're not really generally open as far as I can see. And also, even where they were before the lockdown, most of them were pretty unclean, most of them were pretty poorly maintained, and also most of them were very rarely open anyway. And so for the large part, our cities and public spaces were kind of supplemented in this deficiency through pubs, cafes, shopping centres, etc., providing these facilities, the private sector sort of stepping in for the failure of the public sector or the underinvestment of it. And obviously those things are all closed right now as well. And so effectively what we've had, weather's pretty rough right now, but it's been pretty great in previous weeks. You had loads of people out in all the busiest parts of London, the beautiful parks, being recreational, doing it all very sensibly, staying apart from other people, but enjoying themselves. And, people drink and whatever, they have to go for a pee in a bush. And obviously, that's all pretty innocent and small on a small scale, but on a big scale, it's resulted in a lot of litter, a lot of fairly unpleasant kind of landscapes, and even anecdotally people saying that certain Clapham Common or whatever smells of pee and things like that. And it's obviously not really necessary. It doesn't need to be like this. And so local authorities really need to, in my view, just embrace their responsibility and step up and invest in possibly having some temporary facilities there which are clean, which are well cleaned, which have soap, and which allow people to go about their business in a civilized way while also managing and limiting the control of this epidemic. Now look, I just want to say on as a closing remark, I don't really have a visual to go with this, and it's not really a visual thing, it's more of an experience. But certainly travelling around London, I try to cycle as much as possible. I don't really travel around London that much like most people do. I'm working from home mostly, but it seems like since Monday, when shops, non-essential shops reopened, the level of car traffic on the road has gone up a lot. And it really feels pretty much, and I can hear cars going past on the busy road near where I live, it feels pretty much like private car use is back where it was before this crisis. If you see a bus go past, the bus looks pretty empty actually. Maybe a dozen people on it at most. These are big buses, could have 70 on them. So it seems like we're moving out of this. We're coming back to the restart, the rebound, and it's basically going back to the private car. And I think in a really way that's really sad. It's a bit of a missed opportunity because so much has changed. People are so open to so many different things, and obviously compassion being the most important thing. That it's a real shame that the car is coming back, and the data shows that, for example, the number of people using cars in the congestion charge zone is now equal the number during the day as it is in the evening, and that's just that basically we're returning to old habits. And I think one thing just to think about is that basically data shows that if you're on a low income in London, you're much less likely to own a car. That's obvious, yeah. But also you're much more likely to be exposed to higher levels of air pollution. And effectively, it comes back to the map of air pollution in London. And there is a real coincidence. And it's not just being poor, it's also being from BME backgrounds. You are more likely to live in an area of higher levels of air pollution, but you're also less likely to drive and own a car, right? So the lowest income households are more than 3 times less likely to own a car than the highest incomes. And it shows that on average, the levels of NO2 pollution were on average 24% higher in the most deprived areas than in the least deprived areas. So if you're living in a poor part of London, say for example parts of Southwark, you're going to have much worse pollution than if you live in somewhere like Kensington, or if you live in Highgate or something like that. So really, when we think about that, when you think about getting in a car, we think about how you're going to move around the city, how you're going to restart the city. Remember that level of compassion, because the air pollution, we know it's linked to making the impacts of the coronavirus worse, and we really everybody needs to do everything they can to try and make sure that private car use is limited as much as possible. Anyway, hope you've enjoyed those thoughts and discussions, and do let me know your thoughts. Thanks for listening. I'll be back very soon.